What's up, guys? Welcome back to another daily Bible reading snapshot. Today we're looking at Jeremiah 9 and 10. Then we're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 3. So here in Jeremiah 9, we continue the idea that Jeremiah is crying for the people. He looks at their sin and he says, it is so bad. Your judgment is going to be terrible. You're not repenting. So what does he do? Does he say, I don't care about you guys. I don't care. You guys are all bad and I'm the good one. It's not what he does. He looks and he says, oh, that my head were waters, and that my eyes were a fountain of tears, that I may weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. He says, I am totally moved, and I totally hate all of this that's happening because they've chosen to do what's sinful and wrong instead of repenting and turning back to God. He says, be careful if you trust your neighbor. Be careful if you trust that anyone is going to take over God's plan. He says, remember that they will come to ruin too. He says in verse 6, don't look to those people who are heaping oppression upon oppression and deceit upon deceit. They refuse to know me, which is such a common theme that we see in the book of Jeremiah. How many times does God offer salvation to them? Well, a lot. And further, it's so clear that God prefers for his people to be obedient than for them to be unrighteous. Obviously. I mean, that's kind of like a duh, obviously. But it's important to remember that these people are constantly going after their own sin and rejecting God. He says in verse 11, I will make Jerusalem a heap of ruins. I'm going to destroy it. Further, he says in verse 16, I will scatter them among the nations whom neither they nor their fathers have known. He's going to take these people and throw them out in the whole world. Yes, he's going to gather them back in the end. But the reality is the judgment that they're going to experience is real and it's hard and it's going to be terrible. And he says, let them make haste and raise a wailing. They should have their eyes run down with tears. But the problem is the only person crying about sin is the one who's not committing the sin right now. Do you see how that's ironic? The one who's crying about it is the one, Jeremiah is who I'm talking about. He's the one that's crying about sin. The people of Judah are not crying about their own sin. So while it's important for us to be sympathetic with non-Christians about their sin and even Christians about their sin, that is a very good application from Jeremiah's life, totally. But if you are a person who doesn't weep over your own sin, you're in even more trouble here. You just need to make sure that you're a person who's trusting God instead of thinking about how you're going to get away with your sin and how it doesn't bother you. Very important to remember. And he says at the end of chapter 9, he says, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. So if you're really smart, don't boast because you're smart. He says, let not the mighty man boast in his might. If you've got a lot of strength, don't boast that you're strong. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. So don't boast about all the stuff you have. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord. So God cares so much about people boasting in knowing him. That's more important than all their stuff, all their knowledge, all that, because knowing God is the difference between life and death here in the book of Jeremiah. I don't know if you noticed that, but the people in Jeremiah who know God and live for God, they're the ones that receive some blessing from God. Not that Jeremiah's life is great or anything, but the people who don't know God, they're the ones who are judged here in the end. Chapter 10 is a comparison between God and idols. I don't know if you noticed that here in chapter 10. If you've read before you're watching this, or if you're going to read after you watch this, you're going to see how God is compared to idols. And Jeremiah says, just like the prophet Isaiah said, look, these idols are not real gods. They can't do anything positive or negative. So why do you trust them? He says in verse 21 about the leaders of Israel, he says, my shepherds, they are bad. They're stupid. They do not inquire of the Lord. The people who should be leading the Israelites are not leading. It's a failure of leadership. And he says, look, these people, you're going to be under siege. It says that up in verse 17. Gather, you're gonna be brought to a place where your city is going to be surrounded by enemies and you're going to be destroyed. But in the midst of all this, you see praise of God. I don't know if you see that in verse 6 to verse 10. You see there's no one like God. Your name is great. You're great in might. Who would not fear you, O King of the nations? Right? The answer is the Judeans, the people who are God's people. They're the ones that are not fearing the Lord, but they will. And that's the important thing to remember, that today, if people do not fear God, it's not something that's going to last forever. Everyone right now who does not fear the Lord will one day fear the Lord. Everyone right now who does fear the Lord, they will receive blessing from God. And it's important for us to remember, as we might live as forgiven people, sure, but we should be careful that we do not lose the fear of the Lord, that we walk in his ways every day. So let's turn to the New Testament Looking at 1 Timothy chapter 3, I said yesterday that God makes some rules about who gets to be the leaders and who doesn't get to be the leaders in the church. And he says, I don't permit a woman to exercise authority over a man. Now the question is, well, who should be leading the church? Well, he gives the answer here in chapter 3. He says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be, and then he gives a big long list, right? And what these are qualifications. That's the word people usually use. But what that means is if you're going to be an overseer of the church, which remember, the three offices of church leadership that are referenced all throughout these pastoral epistles and even the books of 1 Peter, you're going to see elder, you're going to see overseer, and you're going to see shepherd or pastor, which is a reference back to the Old Testament people that we just talked about, the bad leaders in Israel. So today in our church, and most churches, they just tend to use the word pastor. Okay, so all three of those words, although they mean different things, they're talking about the same office. So when you see here, office of overseer, you're talking about the office of elder or the office of pastor. That's what you're discussing here. So these qualifications are, what should a person who is a pastor, what should their life look like? And it's all this long list. And really, you might look at this and say, well, great, I'm never going to be a pastor, so I don't never have to live like any of this. Well, that's not true too. Obviously, we're going to see in the rest of 1 Timothy that Paul says to Timothy, make sure everyone's following your example of lifestyle. So set a good example for them. Then the second group of people that's described here are the deacons. Deacons means servant. So the people who are serving in the church. Sometimes they're called ministry leaders in different churches. They're the people who are serving the church. And he says they also need to live to a high standard as well. It's not just the pastors or the elders or the overseers. It's also the servants, the deacons. They need to live a godly life. Now, the qualifications are not as stringent here. They're a little bit less strict. That's true. But still, they're called to a high standard. They're even called to be tested. And it's not just them, also their wives. So some of the women who are going to be leading other women in the church, they also need to be dignified and not slanderers or anything like that. They need to be faithful servants of Christ. Then he wraps this section up by saying, look, I need you to teach this and know that we are living in the household of God. The church is like this big household where God is building it and God is the one who gets glory from it. Then he says the mystery that we confess is the mystery of godliness. What's the mystery of godliness? Well, mystery is a word that means something that was hidden and now is revealed. What does he say? He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. Who are we talking about? Obviously, we're talking about Jesus here, right? He's incarnate. He's vindicated by the Spirit. He lives a Spirit-led life. We also see him seen by angels, proclaimed on among the nations, right? That's what's happening right now. People throughout all the world are believing on Jesus. And also, he was taken up in glory. So the amazing truth is, in the church, we are dealing with the most important person. We're proclaiming and exalting the most important person in the universe, Jesus Christ the Lord, which is why, if you look at these qualifications, why are they so strict? Well, think about what we're doing in the church. We're talking about Jesus, the God of the universe who calls sinners to repent. Certainly, the leaders in the church need to be living up to that as well. So if you are a leader in the church, take this to heart. And if you're not a leader in the church, just look at this and say, I want to live like this regardless of my leadership status, because I know God would want me to live like this anyway. So thanks for reading. We'll see you back tomorrow for another daily Bible reading snapshot.